It was early February when an interview appeared on a small digital platform called Per Mariam, and within hours, it had done something rare in a fragmented religious landscape. It had forced people to stop and pay attention. The voice belonged to Cardinal Raymond Burke, an American who for decades has been one of the most recognizable and unapologetic figures in conservative Catholicism. But this wasn't just another round of culture war talking points. There was something different in the tone, a seriousness that suggested he believed the Church had arrived at a kind of crossroads, one where the usual diplomatic language no longer served any purpose. The Cardinal didn't waste time on pleasantries or caveats. He went straight to what he saw as the heart of the problem, which was not simply disagreement over policy or pastoral strategy, but something far more fundamental. In his view, the Church had reached a point where the very language being used to discuss moral questions had become a source of confusion rather than clarity. For centuries, he argued, there had been a basic distinction that everyone understood. On one side, there were matters where prudence, circumstance, and discernment could legitimately shape how a person acted. On the other, there were moral principles that did not shift with the winds of culture or history. And it was this distinction, he believed, that had become dangerously blurred. He spoke of non-negotiable moral principles, a phrase that has been used in Catholic circles for years but which he deployed with particular force. Some acts, he insisted, are understood by the Church to be incompatible with the moral order in every time and every place. They are not subject to interpretation or subjective evaluation. They do not become acceptable because the person committing them feels sincere or because the surrounding culture has grown more permissive. And when Church leaders begin to speak as if these principles are open to debate or dependent on circumstances, something essential is lost. The faithful become uncertain. The world receives mixed signals. And the Church, which is supposed to be a sign of consistency in a chaotic world, begins to mirror the very confusion it is meant to address. If you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos like this, because what you're about to hear is not just news, it's a wake-up call for every heart that still believes truth should burn brighter than silence. Now grab your rosary, quiet your spirit, and let your heart listen, not just with ears, but with faith. To make his point concrete, the Cardinal turned to the question of human life at its most vulnerable stages. He spoke of the United States, his home country, and he cited statistics that are often buried under clinical language or abstract debate. Hundreds of thousands of lives, he said, taken before birth every year. And his point in citing those numbers was not to score a political point but to ask a deeper question. When the Church itself begins to soften its language around this reality, when it starts to speak in terms or avoid the subject altogether for fear of seeming harsh, what message does that send? He argued that it numbs the collective conscience, that it makes it easier for people to accept compromises they would have rejected a generation ago. The words we choose matter, he said, because they shape how we see the world. And if we stop calling things by their real names, we eventually stop seeing them for what they are. The same logic, he continued, applies to the end of life. He spoke of the care due to the elderly and the dying, the basic assistance that should never be withheld from those who are most vulnerable. Here too, he saw a creeping ambiguity that worried him. If the Church's position on euthanasia or assisted suicide becomes muddled, if the faithful hear mixed messages from their leaders, then the consequences are not merely theoretical. They ripple out into hospitals and nursing homes, into the decisions families make when they are tired and scared and unsure. He stressed the importance of institutions, medical schools and healthcare facilities, that are unambiguously rooted in a Christian vision of the human person. In a culture that increasingly sees suffering as meaningless and death as a problem to be solved by elimination, such places are not optional. They are a necessary witness. From there, the conversation moved to terrain that has become perhaps the most contested of all. Human sexuality and marriage, the Cardinal said, are areas where contemporary cultural pressures have been felt most acutely. And here too, he diagnosed a fundamental error in the way these topics are often approached. The mistake, as he sees it, is to reduce sexuality to a matter of individual desire, to detach it from the deeper architecture of relationship and responsibility and new life. When that happens, love becomes something thin, a feeling to be gratified rather than a commitment to be lived. And marriage, which in the Catholic view is not a human invention but a reality rooted in the natural order, begins to look like just another social arrangement that can be redefined at will. He did not mince words about what he sees happening. There is, he said, an attack on the very structure of marriage. Not necessarily a frontal assault, but a slow erosion, a gradual wearing away of its meaning through 1,000 small shifts in language and law and custom. And when the Church fails to speak clearly about this, when it allows the world's definitions to replace its own, it is not being pastoral or merciful. It is being unfaithful to what it has been given to guard. The family, too, came under his gaze. He described it as the place where the deepest tensions of human life are played out. The logic of sacrifice versus the logic of immediacy. The willingness to give up something now for a greater good later. Contemporary culture, he suggested, has little patience for this kind of thinking. It presents renunciation as a loss, as something to be avoided at all costs. But the Christian tradition has always seen it differently. Sacrifice is not the absence of love but its deepest expression. The difficulties of family life, the struggles and the failures, are not signs that something has gone wrong. They are part of the journey, the raw material out of which character and holiness are forged. And yet, the Cardinal acknowledged, many believers today feel a deep sense of discouragement. They look at the culture around them and see a tide moving in the opposite direction. They wonder if it is even worth trying to defend certain values anymore, or if the battle is already lost. This perception, he said, comes not only from external pressures but from something more insidious. It comes from a gradual loss of faith in the possibility that the truth can actually shape reality. When that confidence fades, the temptation is to retreat, to keep one's head down, to let the world go its own way. But that, he insisted, is not an option for someone who actually believes. Defending life and family is not a strategic choice based on the likelihood of success. It is a consequence of faith. It flows from what the Church holds to be true, and it does not cease to be true simply because it is unpopular. The task remains, regardless of the reaction it provokes. In the final part of the interview, the Cardinal stepped back to take in the larger picture. He spoke of what he called the drift from the faith, and he was careful to distinguish it from a mere moral crisis. This was something deeper. It was an abandonment of the gospel itself, a rejection not just of certain rules but of the whole framework of meaning that had sustained the Church for 2 millennia. And this abandonment, he warned, does not lead to greater human freedom or flourishing. It leads to a form of rebellion that ultimately destroys the very things it claims to liberate. The interview landed in a church already marked by deep internal tensions. Reactions were predictably divided. For some, the Cardinal's words were a necessary corrective, a clear voice in a time of fog. For others, they represented a rigidity that had failed too many people for too long. But whatever one thought of his conclusions, the questions he raised could not be easily dismissed. At a moment when the Church is under enormous pressure to adapt, to soften, to find common ground with a culture that has moved on, the Cardinal was asking whether there are still boundaries that cannot be crossed. Whether there are truths that remain true even when almost no one wants to hear them. It was an old question, but in the winter of 2025, it felt as urgent as ever. If this message touched your heart, like this video and share your thoughts in the comment Amen and stay with us. More Eucharistic stories, deeper reflections, and holy insights are on the way. May Christ in the Eucharist be your light, your rest, your truth. Amen.